This week, the Prime Minister unveiled his long-awaited immigration white paper. He says new measures will substantially reduce the numbers of migrants coming to Britain. But how true is this really? Well, my name's Tom Harwood, and this is GBN Originals. Yes, the Prime Minister is busy touting his plans to deliver, quote, substantial falls in migration. But looking at the numbers, digging deep into the policy tweaks, and assessing the real felt impact of the number of visas issued, will the country even notice? Will the projected falls in net or gross migration numbers be felt to be substantial? Well, the director of the Oxford Migration Observatory, Madeleine Sumption, told us here on GB News that the measures are in the order of 10 to 15% of the total number of visas granted last year. In 2024, non-visit and non-transit visas granted totaled 955,576. Now we can break that down by work visas, that's 369,000, study visas, 419,000, family visas, 86,000, and other visas, including Ukrainians and Hong Kongers, 80,000. Well, all of that adds up to just 44,000 shy of 1 million visas issued. Now, let's be generous and cut that gross migration total by 15%, as Madeleine Sumption suggests in the upper bound of her estimate. That's still 812,240 visas. And you have to wonder if the felt impact of 812,240 visas granted rather than 955,576 visas granted will really match the Prime Minister's Islands of Strangers rhetoric. That rhetoric already being condemned by his own MPs as laying the groundwork for Nigel Farage, as rhetoric comparable to Enoch Powell. Well, beyond the legal numbers, what did the Prime Minister have to say about illegal arrivals? Nada. Zilch. While legal migration is of course entirely distinct from illegal small boat crossings, the issues are enormously conflated in the minds of the public. And one politician who understands this more than most is Nigel Farage, the man leading in the polls and odds-on to be Britain's next Prime Minister. Well, as the current British Prime Minister was speaking from Downing Street, the Reform Party leader was busy tweeting to his millions of followers that already hundreds of migrants were making their way across the Channel, preparing to illegally enter Britain. That day's surge in crossings alone was well over 500 small boat migrants. Which brings us to the Smash the Gangs slogan. Yes, that three-word slogan dreamt up in Westminster, hoping to connect to voters who have lost hope. It's hard to think of a more visceral and communicable crisis for the government than tens of thousands of men, and yes, it is almost exclusively men, clambering aboard rigid inflatable boats and making that 21-mile cross-channel journey to Kent. What feels like a compounding gut punch to millions of voters is that upon arrival, these people are given free housing, free food, free clothing and footwear, free phones, free toiletries, free non-prescription medicines, free laundry, and free travel. Being given all of these things courtesy of the taxpayer, seemingly in thanks for doing the one thing the government says that they mustn't. No, to most voters, it's simply baffling to see the government, and indeed government after government, say it's trying its utmost to stop these small boat crossings, only to immediately reward those who make it to Britain with hotel accommodation and a stipend for other goodies. Indeed, it's hard to think of a stronger metaphor for state failure than a country famed for once having ruled the waves of the world, now being unable to rule the ripples of the English Channel. Of course, what's never properly acknowledged by politicians is the fact that under the 1951 Convention on Refugees, Britain is duty-bound to uphold the core convention principle of non-refoulement, or in plain speaking, never returning an individual to a country where they face serious threats to their life or freedom. In order to meet this legal principle, this high-stakes legal principle, every asylum seeker who managed to set foot in British soil effectively has a guaranteed asylum hearing, and cannot be deported to a country where they may be unsafe. Well, this means that to many the scramble is on. the scramble simply to get to British soil and enter the system. Yet, in the face of tens of thousands of asylum seekers dismissing the pleas of hapless politicians to stay away, the Prime Minister believes he's finally found a solution. Yes, having scrapped the gimmicks of previous premiers, Keir Starmer has one of his own: gang smashing. The theory goes like this. Thousands of helpless migrants are trafficked by a small number of nefarious people-smuggling gangs. These evil gangs stuff their victims onto unsafe boats, bundling them into the UK in what can only be described as something bordering on modern slavery. Once you take out the gangs running the operations, so thinks this government, well, the migrant channel crossings will simply stop. It's tempting, particularly for politicians on the left, to adopt this humanitarian point of view. Through this lens, no one can call you callous. You're helping those on board the boats, because they don't really want to be on those boats. No, you've become a modern-day William Wilberforce. Well, if your worldview is based upon not individual incentives, but instead some sort of oppression Olympics, you might find a prism through which you can respond to the deeply unpopular problem of illegal migration, while also positioning yourself as a champion of the dispossessed. Yes, through this lens, by smashing the powerful people-smuggling gangs, you help the powerless, the asylum seekers. But this entire framework rests upon one fatal conceit: that asylum seekers are all victims, that they lack agency themselves, that they're simply commodities to be smuggled by distinct nefarious characters. But here's the rub. What if perhaps, just perhaps, people seeking asylum in the UK want to seek asylum in the UK? What if they're not travelling under duress, but because they've paid many thousands of pounds to board those boats? What if the gangs are not the cause of the issue, but in themselves represent a response to market demand? What if the constantly press-released arrests of people-smuggling gangs represent about as much success in the battle to prevent channel crossings as arresting drug dealers suppresses the demand for controlled substances? Drug dealers don't create that initial demand for drugs. Initial demand for drugs creates drug dealers. And the same can be said for those that want to cross the channel. And so, despite people-smuggling gang arrests publicised more than ever, 2025 is set to be another record-breaking channel crossing year. Last month bore witness to 10,000 crossings, one full month ahead of the previous year's record. At some point, the government will have to ask itself a piercing question. What happens when you succeed in smashing the gangs and the people continue to come? Because they do want to come. These people aren't trafficked. Many, out of nothing more than rational self-interest, pay their way to better circumstances. Take one asylum seeker, recently interviewed on Newsnight. Amazingly, he said the quiet part out loud. I had asylum in Greece, but as I mentioned, nobody wants to live in a tent. Yes, that's what that small boat asylum seeker said on national television. He paid €3,000 instead to come to Britain, not for asylum or safety, but because of the living standards he was receiving in that safe country of Greece. Well, that's nothing to scorn. That may well be rational from that particular individual's point of view. But that's economic migration and not freedom from torture. Well, let's for a moment assume that migrants have agency and indeed respond to incentives, that they themselves have hopes, dreams and ingenuity, even as much as those nefarious people-smuggling gangs. Yes, once a gang is gone, could it be that a migrant looking to make a better life for himself in a richer country takes thousands of pounds, those same thousands of pounds they'd pay for a place on a small boat, and perhaps buys a boat for himself? Last year even saw a crossing of a couple of migrants in a kayak. Well, it's worth remembering that before the boats there were the lorries. From 2010 to 2015, £316 million was spent to deter illegal immigration in Calais and the surrounding region, namely through significant infrastructure around the port. And the numbers coming across the channel by jumping on heavy goods vehicles consequently plummeted, and the boats started coming instead. Well, this presents a profound conundrum for the British government. The UN Convention on the Law of the Sea places a duty on Britain to rescue any people in distress in its waters. And while France forbids Britain from taking Calais migrants back to the beach they came from, that means taking them back to Blighty. Obviously, returning migrants to France would be the simple answer, but without French cooperation, that becomes legally and practically impossible. So enter Rwanda, a creative policy that perhaps isn't as insane as it sounds, if one has to work within the constraints of the UN conventions the UK is party to. By deporting asylum seekers, both legitimate and illegitimate, to a safe third country, you can avoid the refoulement principle of that UN convention. Theoretically, no longer could you be halted by the courts from putting asylum seekers in harm's way, as the country they're being sent to is safe. Well, while Rwanda was derided as a gimmick, it's hard to see how to control your asylum system through anything other than the use of a safe third country, if your starting point is following that 1951 UN convention. Where else do you send migrants who have made it to your shores, particularly if they come from a country deemed to be unsafe, if they come from a country like Afghanistan, Iran, Syria, or Sudan? Well, of course, flying people halfway around the world seems impractical. Can there be any other way of fixing this problem? Well, enter one Tony Blair back in 2001. Yes, as Prime Minister, Tony Blair saw the beginnings of a new age of global migration. As communism fell, as global trade opened up, countries around the world got richer. And far from a lack of economic development facilitating the movement of people, it was actually a greater level of economic development that allowed people in these desperately poor countries, previously stuck there, to move for the first time. Well, Tony Blair saw the UN Convention on Refugees as wildly out of date, designed for an era of post-war Europe, not of a global flow of millions of people across the world. As Prime Minister, he proposed convention reform. He said the UK is taking the lead in arguing for reform, not of the convention's values, but of how it operates. Well, more than 20 years later, it's time to revisit Tony's idea. If the only sensible option within the 1951 Convention on Refugees is something as mocked and derided as the Rwanda policy, perhaps the time has come for the government to throw its entire diplomatic weight behind convention reform. Yes, changing that 1951 convention, no longer being bound by those principles that so bind the UK government when it comes to deporting those asylum seekers. Well, it's easy to see how Starmer could find allies for his 21st century mission. In Italy, in Denmark, in the Netherlands, in Australia, and in the United States. But will Keir Starmer take up from when Tony Blair left off back in the early 2000s? Somehow I think he would prefer to play the endless game of whack-a-mole that he calls Smash the Gangs. Well, what do you make of it? Would the Rwanda scheme have worked, or is it indeed a gimmick? Does Smash the Gangs actually get to the root of the problem? And could it have been Tony Blair, after all, more than 2 decades ago, who alighted on the original solution? To unbind Britain and so many other countries from that original 1951 convention that was meant to apply and was written with the mind of people just moving within Europe, and now applies to the flows of millions of people around the world. What do you make of it? Do get involved in the comment section below, and remember to subscribe to the GBN YouTube channel for more original content.